Myra, a member of the Foggy Bottom West End Village Program Committee. Welcome to another Art Thursday Zoom presentation by the Foggy Bottom West End Village. We are very pleased today to bring back one of our very own villagers, Lorna Grenadier, who fortunately for all of us is also a longtime docent and history maven. Today, Lorna will share the remarkable and inspiring stories of Myra, Bradwell, and Roland Hayes with some surprises along the way. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to Lorna. Enjoy the time with her, and thank you for joining us. Lorna.
Thank you, Jackie and Jonas. It's always a delight to be here, and I hope everyone is warm and well. And if I may, today, February 18th, is a meaningful day for me. It would have been the 101st birthday of a very dear friend and neighbor, Mary Cardoso. Like Myra Bradwell, she had a case that went to the Supreme Court. Like Roland Hayes, she loved to sing and she loved opera. And like them both, she was dedicated to further equality. So I'd like to dedicate this program to her. Thank you. So we'll start with Myra Bradwell. Myra Bradwell was born in 1831. And here you see her on the screen on the left. She's probably middle-aged in this picture. And just next to her is Roland Hayes. This is also probably around the time he's 40-ish or so, but looking very, they both look, I think, very contemplative. And they're artists, both of them are artists in different ways. So Myra, and we'll see her in the next slide, is a much younger woman, next to the man she is to marry, but it's a much older image. Jonas, if you can advance the screen, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. And so I'm sorry, I couldn't find a picture contemporaneous with hers, but it was definitely a love match. She came from a family that had very strong, deep ties going back to the 1600s in New England. And they were abolitionists. They were very progressive, and she grew up hearing stories of equality. James Bradwell, who met her while she was in school, she got a very good education. They fell in love, and her family was not thinking this was a good match, that it was beneath their standards because he was working as a manual laborer. He was very ambitious. He was working his way through school, and he eventually wanted to be a lawyer, and he did become a member of the bar. He was very good at whatever he did. He even became a photographer. So despite the family objection, they eloped. So I think that tells us something about Myra, that she knows her own mind. They, for a while, went to Memphis, where they opened a private school. It was a very good school. But after a couple of years, they decided to return to Chicago. And while they were, when they got to Chicago, he opened a law practice, and she was working alongside him. She also wanted to study the law, and this was her philosophy. She felt that if a husband and wife work side by side, and they think side by side, that there'd be no need for divorce. So she certainly found, I think, the right guy for her. By the time the Civil War comes along, and its end, they had 4 children. Sadly, only 2 of them survived. And during the war, she was very active, raising funds for the welfare of the soldiers. And she gained some very meaningful professional skills. So that by 1868, Jonas, if we go to the next screen, we'll see the result of her endeavors. She became the publisher, editor-in-chief, and business manager of the Chicago Legal News. She saw a need for such a publication. There were others in the country, not many, but none of them had been started by a woman. As it turned out, she didn't have to wait very long, though it was published, I think, for 25 years. So there were 1,300 copies. It was a weekly. But within a little more than a year, her publication was deemed the official medium for reporting of state court laws and judgments. It had a very wide readership, and she expanded the coverage to include the Supreme Court and federal. So it then had a national readership, and it was very, very highly respected, so much so that the Illinois state legislature said, if you've read it, if it's been printed in the Chicago Legal News, it's okay as evidence in court. So it provided her with a platform as well to be an advocate. She could, and her audience, her readers were legislators, judges, the governor, members of the bar, all the people who would shape the laws that could be changed. And she did use humor along the way. But she wanted to do things like reform the legal system. Judges were getting drunk, juries were being bribed. She had concern about women, family issues, children's custody, even railroad regulation. If she thought something needed fixing, she would write about it, and was very persuasive. And she also had a very good link to the legislature because her husband, James, had been elected to serve in the state. And so she would help draft laws and he would get them passed. So she was very, very accomplished and successful in this regard. But there was a great tragedy in Chicago that you'll see in the next screen. What happened is there was a huge fire. So you'll see the devastation in the next slide. And her family got separated, their offices and home were destroyed, and they were very anxious about the welfare of their daughter. But when they were reunited, their daughter had the foresight and courage to take all of their subscription books, all the information they needed, so that they could resume publishing in Milwaukee. They set up offices there, and they continued to publish. The respect that her publication had was such that the Illinois legislature said that because so many legal records and documents have been lost in this tragic event, if you can show that it was published in the Chicago Legal News, we'll accept that as evidence of whatever rights and protections you have. So while all of this is going on, even before 1869, Myra feels that she's learned enough about the law. She sits to the bar exam and passes with honors. So she proudly submits her letter to the court, please admit me. So I'd like to practice law. And they said, sorry, you're a woman. You can't do that. So she decides, well, I'm going to take this to the Supreme Court. And she did. But why would she do that when in 1872, she and another woman drafted a statute that was adopted by the state of Illinois that said, and I quote, no person shall be precluded or debarred from any occupation, profession, or employment, except military, on account of sex. So when that was adopted, she could have just reapplied and been admitted to the bar. But she went to the Supreme Court because she knew that if she prevailed there, that all women in all the states would have the ability. So there you see, you had that, there we go. That was the Supreme Court in the Capitol building at the time when it was argued in 1873. And her attorney was from Milwaukee. I think she may have met him there. I don't know for sure, but he was one of the most renowned constitutional lawyers in the country. His name is Senator Matthew Hale Carpenter. Matthew Hale, having been a very, very distinguished English jurist. And in fact, Carpenter changed his name because that's what people were calling him. So he made that official. But in any event, he made a 14th Amendment argument to the Supreme Court that they rejected. They said, under the, because the question, I guess, that was put to the court is the right to obtain a license to practice law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to all citizens of the United States. And the Supreme Court didn't want to connect gender with citizenship, because then it would have opened the door to women having the right to vote. In fact, they heard another case just before that where they rejected a similar kind of argument. So she did not prevail in the court, though she had an inside vote. It just turns out that the Chief Justice at the time, Salmon Chase, was a distant cousin, and he did vote for her argument. But the other justices said to her work, and
we lost Lorna. I don't hear Lorna.
She seems to have frozen. Sorry. I don't know where Lorna went.
Lorna.
Well, something I could do without her is I'll jump ahead. There's an excellent video we had prepared of Roland Hayes, who's the second half of this presentation, singing. But since Lorna seems to have dropped out, I think I'll jump right to the video, if that's okay with everybody. It is an excellent, excellent recording, and I certainly think it's very fun to listen to. So I'll jump right to that right now. Optimize.
Vesti la Juba. Here is Roland Hayes singing Vesti la Juba.
Lorna back, or do we fully lose Lorna?
I'm here.
Okay, good. Well, sorry to jump ahead to the video, but we'll go back to the presentation now that
Thank you for that. That's a nice little commercial break, but it will give you a flavor when we do get to Roland Hayes that you'll appreciate his singing. He's just wonderful. So when I was, I think where I ended was Myra Bradwell's with her news work and to Chicago. She helped to lobby to bring the Columbia Exposition there. And I learned about the Bradwells is that they were friends with Mary Todd Lincoln. And they were sufficiently connected that she gave them gifts from her husband's presidency, including the pen allegedly used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Robert Todd Lincoln, you may know, had his mother committed to this particular residence, the Bellevue Place. It was a very elegant, very peaceful place, thought that she could recover from all the traumas, but she didn't want to be there. And so she started writing letters to Myra Bradwell. And eventually they assisted her in leaving there to be with her sister. Mary Todd Lincoln eventually went to Europe for several years to live. She was much happier there. There was nothing there to remind her of all her tragedies, but she did come back to the United States and reconciled with her son. But those letters exchanged between the two women became the subject of recent books. They were thought lost. The Lincoln family did not want them to see the light of day, had actually paid off Myra Bradwell's daughter not to publish them, but they were in the news not that long ago. So that was something unexpected. I guess everyone in Illinois were very close. And then if we go to the next image, Jonas, I think this may be the Columbia Exposition. I don't know if you heard, she was Myra Bradwell. I'm sorry if I'm repeating. She lobbied Congress to bring the exposition there. She was on the board of managers, and she also persuaded the International Law Conference to include 4 women. And so that was a feather in her cap. And then we go along to the, what I should also say was happening at the time, she became ill. And her husband, unbeknownst to her, wrote to the Supreme Court of the United States saying, could you please admit her as a practicing attorney? And they did that, and they dated it 1869, when she actually would have applied, so that she can have the appellation of being the first woman to pass a bar and who then pursued the law. She died in 1894, and her memorial includes an image created by Leonard Volk. If you've been to the National Portrait Gallery, you've seen his plaster face mask and hand models of Abraham Lincoln. That slide you just saw, Jonas, there you go. So what impact, she's one of the first. Well, how many have there been since then? Well, there were 5 women lawyers in 1870. At 1900, there were about 1,000. In 1960, where this chart begins, there are a few thousand, but it is until 1970 that the surge begins, when the 20th century women's movement really takes off, the latter half. And so by 2016, there are 400,000 women, according to this census, women lawyers, but not necessarily all practice. So we got onto the final screen, and I think this is worth waiting for, because only Myra Bradwell, the Wonder Woman, DC Comics in 1950, featured a story about her. They had a periodic story called Wonders. And you can see her at the top, Jim, I passed the exam. And he says, oh, let's go and celebrate. Let's go out to dinner. And the man below is reading the Chicago Legal News. How does Mrs. Bradwell do it? She's a wonder. And then in the bottom screen, we see her before the court being sworn in. So she truly was a Wonder Woman and made a difference. But I think, even Wonder Women periodically need a break. So when winter came, every once in a while, she would head down to Florida. And wouldn't we all like to do that today? So you had a chance now to hear Roland Hayes, and I'd like now to talk about him. His beginnings were very different from Myra Bradwell's. His mother had been enslaved in Georgia. She met William Hayes. They married and had several children. He had some Cherokee background, and Roland was very close to his dad. He said his father was his first teacher. And look at this photograph of him. I think that there's even a photograph that exists is remarkable. But he's just this, you just want to cuddle him. And he and his dad would go out to the fields and they'd listen to the birds. And Roland could mimic the sounds that the birds were making. He had a marvelous ear. And unfortunately, his father dies, and the mother moves the whole family to Chattanooga, which was only about 70 miles from where they were living. And that's the house that you see there. His mother, Fanny, to whom he was very attached, and she was called Angel Mother or Angel Mo, would take him to the local Baptist church, which actually had both white and Black congregants. And there would be spirituals sung, and he loved that. He encounters someone who visits the church, a musician, hears Roland singing and says, "You've got this wonderful tenor. What are you going to do with it?" And Roland at that time is about 16. And he says, "Well, I don't know. I just know that I sing because I like to." So he gets encouraged to take music lessons and to pursue it further. He ultimately winds up at Fisk University, established by the American Missionary Society, along with other historically Black colleges, to educate former slaves and the children of former slaves. And he's not very well advanced academically, but he auditions for them and they said, "Okay, we'll take you on." So he's there for several years studying. And we go to the next slide, Jonas. You'll see him in 1910. I think there's a photograph of him on the left, and you can see with the top hat, he's looking rather dashing, but he's already in his early 20s. The woman in the picture next to him on the right is Jenny Robinson. She was a white woman. She's actually taller than he. He was just 5'4". So, but she was responsible for, not only did she teach him, but she was responsible for his being dismissed from the school because he was performing unauthorized concerts off campus, and that was a no-no. She also didn't approve of spirituals. She was very conservative in her musical taste. She thought only European composers were adequate. And ironically, Roland Hayes learned later that it was Jenny Robinson who had been supporting him, paying his tuition to be in school. But while he was at Fisk, while he was in Tennessee, he had jobs working in the homes of fairly well-off white families, and they were very supportive of him. They had gramophone recordings of operas, which he thoroughly enjoyed that. But they also introduced him to social niceties. And along the way, he encounters a man who's from Boston. He's a businessman from Boston. And the gentleman says, "Look, if you're ever up in Boston, look me up. I think you've got a great voice. We should do something." And sure enough, Roland goes up to Boston. He has an opportunity with the Jubilee Fisk Singers. And he knew that, he was not going to come back to Tennessee, but he wanted to bring his mother there. And if we go on to the next slide, Jonas, we'll see he has been introduced to music teachers. He worked with Arthur Hubbard for many, many years. They stayed close through the rest of his life. And, the issue for Roland Hayes as a musician, as a Black musician, was, would white people come to hear him? He knew he would get jobs and concert opportunity playing. He would be accepted to Symphony Hall. That here he is in Boston. It's a great critical and musical financial success. In fact, it continued. He went, that's Carnegie Hall on the right, and you can see how popular he is. They had to include stage seating to accommodate people. So while that recital was very well received, it didn't give him quite what he needed to go further. So he decided, I've got to go to Europe. And so in the next slide, we'll see in 1920, when he went to Britain, he winds up performing in 1921 at Wigmore Hall. It's around Easter time. He's been singing this beautiful spiritual, We Were There, a cappella. And you can see it so moved the audience, they were in tears. And someone took a photograph of Hayes that inspired a sculptor to turn that photo into the bust that you see in the bottom right. But what was extraordinary about that concert, first of all, Roland Hayes had pneumonia, and yet he was able to pull off this amazing performance. The next day, he gets an invitation from Buckingham Palace to come and sing for the King and Queen of England. Can you imagine? Amazing. So he goes to sing for the King and Queen. It's a rather informal visit. He stayed much longer than had been on their schedule, and it was a delightful time. So you can imagine now he has his bona fides, and he eventually returns to Boston, and we see that in the next screen. Here he's back at Boston Symphony Hall, but rather than doing an individual recital, he's going to sing with the BSO itself, a full orchestra conducted by Pierre Monteux, the very prominent conductor there at the top. And this time, you know, he's the man. He's the man. This becomes now, this concert, his calling card for all future musical events with other major orchestras in Europe and the United States. It also leads to what we see in the next slide. The NAACP, because of this, the response to this performance, gives him their highest award, the Spingarn Medal. It was awarded to him in 1924. He couldn't be there for the ceremony because he was off in Europe performing. And so you see next year on a ship, as he's again bound for Europe, Walter Damrosch, the conductor there, with James Weldon Johnson, who was also not only the executive secretary of the NAACP, but a poet, best known for the lyrics that he wrote with his brother that became the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. So there's Roland Hayes, Spingarn Medal, 1925. They were Roland Hayes now being the recognized as a major figure in the Harlem Renaissance. So he's made. Sadly, what comes next is the Depression. But I did want to say, if I can go back and tell you that that concert that he did at the BSO in 1923, his mother was there to see it. And so she also got to appreciate that her son had succeeded. So what was it that made Roland Hayes' music so special? Well, it was the way he delivered it. He could sing songs that covered a span of 6 centuries, written by 130 composers. He could sing in 6 languages. He was a first-class musician. His gift of interpretation was extraordinary. Even when he was 70, a critic said, what Mr. Hayes does is live each song he sings. So to be in front of a microphone on a radio or to make a recording were not quite as satisfying for him. And so he missed out on a lot of economic opportunities. He was making a lot of money, doing like 80 concerts a year, was about $100,000. So, but he would, during the 30s, he didn't have a lot of work. He did perform at Constitution Hall before they barred Black performers. That was in 1931. He went to Hollywood Bowl. And in 1937, he did get a chance to go back to Paris at least once. But between the Depression and Europe not being so hospitable to a man of color, it really is a shame how circumstances really robbed him of sharing his extraordinary gift with more people. If we go to the next slide, I think this to recognize how much race, of course, race was very much a part of his life. And Booker T. Washington, felt that he was the most famous Black at the time in the early 20th century. And he said, be the best you can be and you'll get respect. And Roland Hayes ascribed to that. But the woman on the left was a Bohemian countess. She was married with her own children. She was amazed at Roland Hayes. She had to meet him. She showed up unannounced in his hotel room. They later became lovers, and her ambition was to remove racial barriers, and she wanted to have a child with him. And she did. They had a little girl. She said, I only wanted to bring that into the world to prove one can have as well in Black as in his late 40s at the time. He said, I'd like to adopt her. And he put in all the dough. Hayes actually marries a cousin who he'd taken in. She was sick. She managed his household, and but the Countess and Roland Hayes terminated their relationship at around 1931 or so. But Roland Hayes felt that, his people come first and he needed to impress them. But his reputation and his standing in the world was not enough to protect him. So if we go to the next slide, Jonas, you'll see that in 1942, he's down back in Georgia, the family homestead. He'd bought the farm where his mother had worked and been enslaved. And he wanted to make it into an artist colony, but there weren't funds to do that. But he still thought of that as home. And he and his family are there, and there's an incident, a misunderstanding about his wife and daughter sitting in a whites only section. The police are called, they arrest him, throw him in the car, beat him around the head. Can you imagine a singer? And they take him and his wife and daughter to jail. They're released. There are no charges are ultimately filed, but you can see it made headlines everywhere. New York Times, Time Magazine, international news outlets. And so there's an uproar. The Justice Department gets involved, and there was a federal investigation. I think that led to the officer being fired and ultimately prosecuted. But what's interesting is Roland Hayes's reaction to this. And he said, I cannot help my adversaries by hurt nor hate. The only way to remind them of their brutality is to be kind to them. I have been through many a scourge in my life, but never has my fortitude been put to such a test before as during that experience in Rome. So it brings him again to national attention, which may have helped with the sale of a biography that came out soon after that. And if we go to the next slide, Jonas, we can see during World War II, he's called upon by Eleanor Roosevelt, please go to Britain. There have been race riots there. Maybe you can increase morale, do a performance. The British love you. He goes to Royal Albert Hall. 200 Black soldiers are recruited, a special piece is composed for them. And you can see him on the top left with the military there, how dashing he looks with his bowler hat and his spats on his shoes. And it was a mesmerizing concert. This is a rehearsal photo that you see wearing his coat. It was kind of chilly there, but he came out in uniform and it brought down the house. He did many concerts while he was there, but the military asked him, before you leave England, could you please investigate what's causing all this dissension, what's causing the difficulties in race relations? And Roland Hayes goes out, he interviews the soldiers and everyone. He says, the problem is not with the British, it's with the Southern whites. And so he puts his findings in a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. And she says, well, I'm sharing that with FDR. So he, was doing his duty to help his country as well. But what was interesting, he had been interviewed many years before that by a Black journalist who said, each appearance that you make does more to break down racial prejudice than large numbers ensuring positive human relations. So after the war, not much left for him to do. He does get a part-time position at Black Mountain College. The audiences loved him, integrated, and so because of him, they were able to hire their first Black faculty and bring in a Black student. He auditioned for a Broadway adaptation of Cry the Beloved Country in the late 40s, Kurt Weill, Maxwell Anderson. It's hard to imagine that he would have to audition for that, but he was not selected, Todd Duncan. He then taught voice at Boston University for a couple of years. And then he did get back to Europe in 1954 after he wrote to President Eisenhower saying, I'm volunteering. How can you use me? And so they sent him to Europe to do some concerts. This is a photograph of him done by Carl van Vechten. And I think it just captures the essence of him. He was a bit of a shy person, but he had a persona about him. And in the next slide, you'll see that finally in 1962, he's performing his farewell concert at Carnegie Hall. It was a fundraiser for the Black schools. And it was on that occasion that the American Missionary Society, which had funded the legal costs for the Amistad ship, the slave ship. I don't know if you saw the cases in the Supreme Court. The presidents argued, John Quincy Adams. And so the Amistad tradition, this was the first year they were making the award. And it was presented to him by Virgil Thomson, the very, very well-known music critic and composer. And he ended the presentation by saying to Roland Hayes, "You do the human race an honor to exist." And I think, as he might have said, music is a language that everyone speaks. A little footnote about his teaching voice. One of his voice students in Boston was the father-in-law of Yo-Yo Ma. So I appreciate your hanging in there for these intermittent breaks we've taken, but just wanted to say that both Hayes and Bradwell, they were both extraordinary people. They persisted under adversity. They were fortunate to have partners, family, friends who were supportive. With Myra Bradwell, her spouse, I can't imagine her being able to do what she did without his support and encouragement. And for Roland Hayes, certainly his mother inspired him, but music teachers as well, and so many other people along the way, and he reciprocated with them. And as the title of the program was Voices for Change, Myra Bradwell used her pen to advocate for women and the legal system. And for Roland Hayes, it was his voice and his art that he used to better human relations. So thank you very much. There's so much more that I could say, but I'm eager if you have questions, I can try to fill in the blanks. And thank you again, everyone. I really do. I'm so sorry. It's my unstable computer, I think, the connection here.
No worries. I think it did go stop and start, but I think it went well overall.
Well,
Yeah, I certainly learned a lot. There's absolutely figures that you find when you do these things, Lorna.
you know, you never, it's like, for me, it's a treasure hunt. I never know what I'm going to find. And I was just telling Jackie and Jonas before today's program started, I had discovered a reference in David Gergen's, the political consultant journalist, that he'd worked for Jerry Ford as president. And one of his jobs was to manage the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And it turns out that Roland Hayes had been nominated. But it didn't come to pass. So now the question is, what happened? You know, it was, I think the Ford administration was possibly coming to an end. Maybe there wasn't an opportunity. And then sadly, Roland Hayes died in 1977.
The first question came in was on Bradwell. Do you know where she went in Florida?
Augustine, St. Augustine. In fact, I'll tell you a little footnote. I think it was Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She also went down to Florida, and she would start writing these little essays about it. And I think the state of Florida attributes its being a tourist destination to her. So I think St. Augustine was such an old, wasn't it the first major settlement? So I think that's how she wound up in St. Augustine.
You kind of answered this question after it came in, but did Roland Hayes have financial success?
Oh, yes, yes. When he was at the peak of his career, by the time he was 40, he was a millionaire. But he gave a lot of money away. He supported his family. He bought his mother's farm. If anybody had need of money, they would come to him. But once the Depression hit and he couldn't concertize anymore, that was his sole source of income. As I said, you know, he was reluctant to do all the things that Paul Robeson had done, who was very close to Roland Hayes. So he, you know, his daughter, French daughter, she grew up in France, Myra, corresponded with her father. And she said, "Can you help me financially?" And he said, "Well, I'll look into it." You know, he was too embarrassed to say outright, "I can't afford to help you." But as I mentioned, his cousin, who he later married, was sick. And he said, you know, "Come live at my house. I'm not there, and you can stay there." And he was a very kind-hearted soul. But, you know, he was a man of great dignity as well. And I know he did love to laugh too. I had pictures of him, you know, laughing, but I don't know if you all feel this way, but when I learn as much about these people, you know, some of them, I'd like to get to know them. They're just so interesting. And I'm so glad that you all had a chance to hear his music. I hope that made some impression, because it's the magic of technology that we can hear something he sang 100 years ago. And in fact, I should tell you that the Library of Congress has a National Recording Registry, and the spiritual "Were You There" that he sang a cappella in London that brought people to tears is now in the Library of Congress's registry. But you can find it on YouTube. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. And he was technically gifted. He did something, I learned something about music. It's called a mezzo di voce, I think, where he sings this, "Oh, you're on the same pitch," and then you increase or decrease the loudness. That's very difficult to do technically, apparently. I never knew that, but he mastered it.
Great. There were a couple of the questions that came in from the chat. Was it unusual that he wasn't trained in the church?
It's interesting that you ask that. His mother wanted him to be a preacher. You know, she says, why should we spend all this money for you to go learn white folks music? You know, you can be a preacher. And I don't know if anybody's watching. I haven't watched it yet. The Black Church that's on PBS right now. Certainly there is a lot of music in the church, but what Roland Hayes did that was different, and I think that brought his mother some pleasure, I imagine, is that he was performing Black music in the concert hall. He made it respectable. I don't like to use that word, not respectable, acceptable. And the musicality, he actually wrote a book of his favorite spirituals that was published in the 40s. He arranged various spirituals, and when he made that trip to England, I know I'm going down a different path here. When he went to England, his ultimate goal was to go to Africa. There was a Pan-African conference there. He met W.E.B. Du Bois. But he got to know enough. He had questions because he'd interviewed his mother's enslaver. He wanted some history about his own family. And they were able to tell him that his forebears, I think great-great-great-grandfather, had been brought to the South from Ivory Coast and had been a tribal leader. And so he had hoped to go, he was like a musicologist. He wanted to go to Africa. And the irony is he never did, but he was interested in that part. He thought that was as much a part of Americana as other kinds of music. I mean, it was actually probably more authentic than singing European composers. So does that answer the question about, that's a long-winded answer to the church, but I think, but he himself was very spiritual. And I think he felt that through his body, through his singing, he was conveying that spirituality. It was, I don't think he really felt alive unless he was singing.
Great. There was one last question that came in through the chat. Did either of them write their own memoirs?
No, I have not even seen, there is a very brief biography by Jane Friedman of Myra. Actually, her real name is Myra Bradwell. But Roland Hayes actually had someone interview him and speak to him. So he just spoke his biography, and that was written. And then more recently in 2015, there's a wonderful book, Roland Hayes, his legacy, that goes into his papers. He has, like, I think thousands and thousands of documents that are in the collection at the Detroit Public Library. And what's interesting, what did he name his daughter? Africa. So his memory was not good late in life, and so that's why he had to stop singing. But he had the forethought to talk to his mother's enslavers to get that part of the family information. He was interested in documenting things, but he himself didn't write an autobiography. But there's, I think, more written about him than about Myra Bradwell.
Great. Does anyone from the group have any questions before we wrap up? But I do want to say thank you very much. Just sticking with us for a few technical difficulties, but I think we finished strong.
Thank you all. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. You can email me directly, or Jonas can forward it. But these were two very, very special people. And again, I have to say, I'm always admiring at how people handle adversity and are able to realize their dreams and talents. So thank you for hanging in there. At least they weren't commercial breaks.
Okay. Thank you very much.
And do explore YouTube.